delighted to have him in our community and speaking here tonight.
Thank you.
for being here.
Happy Earth Day, everyone. So it's the 55th anniversary. First Earth Day was 1970. So, Aaron asked me to talk about rewilding of Metropolitan Detroit. And this is my favorite picture. Who knows where this was taken?
Oh, taken. It's the carousel on the riverfront.
There you go. It's the carousel on the Detroit Riverwalk. And a good colleague and friend of mine who does programming for the Riverwalk one day saw a beaver come out of the Milliken Park wetlands and started walking on the Riverwalk. And she had the wherewithal to take a bunch of pictures, but then do an extended video of it. And then she went back and got a friend to choreograph it with music and put it on, and it went viral across North America. The beaver are back, and then really fun, but that kind of sets up the whole idea of rewilding. So, rewilding is like bringing nature back to where it belongs. It belongs everywhere, right? Nature, we should have some nature everywhere. We do have it, lots of it in wilderness areas and rural areas. We don't have that much in urban areas. So this concept that came out, said it aims to restore ecosystems and reverse the decline of biodiversity by allowing wildlife and natural processes to reclaim areas no longer under human management. This really just helps rebalance ecosystems. Oh, I'm going to have to get used to the arrows. Probably the best example of rewilding in the world is Yellowstone National Park, because wolves were, well, I'll tell you the story a little more here. In western expansion, expanding to the west, the settlers brought livestock to the Yellowstone area and the region, and ever since then, wolves have been villainized. Their central role in the balance of the Yellowstone ecosystem was not really recognized, and wolf predation on animals like elk was viewed as wanton destruction of desirable species like elk. So in the late 1800s, they started wolf control, both hunting them and then poisoning them as well. By the 1920s, more than 130 wolves have been killed in the park. Here's an archival photo of it. In the name of conservation, that's what they were trying to do. The last wolf was reported to have been killed in 1926. So the absence of Yellowstone's top predator reaped havoc within the wider ecosystem, including increasing the elk population because they weren't preyed on them anymore, right? So they increased the elk population, led to an overwhelming decline of plant species like the aspen and willows and the grasses eaten by the elk. So then they started thinking about, well, should we reintroduce wolves? They aren't, a menace like they thought. They played an important role in balancing the ecosystem. And so to do that in a national park, you had to do an environmental impact statement. So they did that in 1994, and they were given approval to experiment with reintroducing wolves to the park. So in 1995, they trapped 14 wolves from Jasper National Park in Alberta, Canada, brought them down and released them into the park. And by 2023, there are 108 wolves in Yellowstone. So wolf reintroduction has helped parts of the ecosystem bounce back. Today, nearly 30 years after wolves were reintroduced, the elk population is down, opening the door for willow, aspen, beaver, songbird populations to recover. So it's probably one of the best examples of the impacts of rewilding. Obviously, although cities were as wild as Yellowstone, introducing top predators in Detroit or Chicago or Cleveland or New York is not practical. Instead, rewilding of urban areas often looks quite different and often includes reintroducing native plant species, building greenways or parks on vacant lots, incorporating green infrastructure to manage stormwater and enhance habitat, and simply allowing nature to reclaim spaces. You might be surprised to learn that Detroit has become a leader in urban rewilding. And it's really a unique story. We all know, who knows what this picture is of? Downriver people, come on. McLeod Steel site that's no longer there, 1.2 miles of waterfront, but many of these industries dominated the shoreline. So for 100 years, Detroit River was perceived as a working river that supported industry and commerce, and pollution was just part of the cost of doing business. So this is the same, a little different angle of the McLeod Steel plant there. And this is one of the outfalls there, and you can see oil coming in there. This is 1962. This is the Black Lagoon in Trenton that was cleaned up, contaminated sediments from all those years for $9.2 million. And then this is U.S. Steel and E-Course, and this is pickle liquor from the steel making process in the river. But those were common sites in the 1960s. Back then, this is the Detroit River here, and this is the Rouge River as it comes in, the confluence of the Rouge and Detroit River. You see this conical shaped plume is the submerged discharge pipe for the old Detroit wastewater treatment plant. And that they were in non-compliance back then. So this is partially treated human waste. And you can see all the brown coming in here, which is raw sewage. And then you see streaks of oil that are coming in. But the Federal Water Pollution Control Administration, which was the predecessor of US EPA, said back then that Detroit River was one of the most polluted rivers in the United States. Back then, all that oil that you saw coming in from the McLeod Steel site and then upriver as well, in the Rouge River, in 1960, 12,000 ducks and geese died in one event because of oil in the river, and it was wintertime and there was only a few pockets of oil, and the oil filled the pockets of open water. The ducks and geese landed, got soaked in oil, and died. And so in 1967, another 5,400 ducks and geese died in a similar one. This is an archival photo from the Bentley Library at U of M, showing a Michigan conservation officer and holding some of the oil-soaked ducks and geese. A big part of that pollution, there was industries and there were municipalities, but this is the largest single on-site wastewater treatment plant in the United States. If you go north on I-75 and you get to the Rouge River Bridge and you look to your right, you will see this plant. It has a new name. It's called the Detroit Water Resource Recovery Facility now, but most people know it as the Detroit Wastewater Treatment Plant. So in the 1960s, this plant was only achieving primary treatment which is removal that can either, removal of material that can either float or settle out, and some disinfection. And Detroit's combined storm and sanitary sewer system was discharging about 31 billion gallons of untreated waste to these waterways on an annual basis. That is an enormous amount. In the 1960s, we were at the peak of the use of things like DDT and dieldrin and toxaphene, these persistent organic compounds, pesticides, and here's an example. So in the 60s, reproductive failure of bald eagles, peregrine falcons and osprey were occurring due to eggshell thinning from things like DDT. And so this is a normal peregrine falcon egg on the left, and here's one showing impacted by DDT, and you can see the cracks in the egg. That was prevalent and common in that time. There were no lake sturgeon or lake whitefish spawning in the river during that time. And then in 1969, October of that year, the lower Rouge River caught on fire. For some of you who've lived down here a long time, this is the Rouge River drawbridge. Ford Motor Company stack. Here is a picture, an archival photo of the John Kendall, the fireboat at that time, the Detroit fireboat, containing the fire on the Rouge River. You can't put a fire on a river, you have to contain it. That was 1969. Then, of course, 1970 was the first Earth Day, and most people think of Santa Barbara, California, with the first Earth Day because of the Santa Barbara oil spill. People would think about Wisconsin and Senator Gaylord Nelson because he started Earth Day and recruited NSAs. But this is an archival photo from the Walter Reuther Library, April 22nd, 1970. The first boat with an American flag is the UAW. Second boat with a Canadian flag is the CAW, the Canadian Auto Workers, coming together on the first Earth Day to hold a wake on the river, symbolizing the death of the river. That was 1970. Because of that, all that pollution, people started to speak out. What an amazing set of accomplishments because people cared about the quality of the environment. That resulted in the signing of the National Environmental Policy Act of 1970. That's the Magna Carta of environmental laws throughout the United States. More laws throughout the world are modeled after NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act, than any other one. That was 70. Clean Water Act of 1972, the Canada Water Act of 1970, the Canada-US Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement of 1972, and the Endangered Species Act of 1973. That led to the cleanup of these waterways. It would not have happened unless we had those laws and that agreement. So we've seen substantial reductions in oil discharges and spills. And winter duck kills due to oil pollution have been eliminated. We've spent billions of dollars with a B on municipal wastewater treatment plant upgrading to achieve secondary treatment with phosphorus removal. We've seen a 90% decline. This is phosphorus concentration. Big drop here to more recent years. And this is loading to the river. A 90% decline in phosphorus concentration and loading from the Detroit plant. Since 1960, there has been a 90% reduction in combined sewer overflow volume coming from communities. Although more is needed, excuse me, this is a substantial One thing you should think about is combined storm and sanitary sewers. Old cities like Detroit, Chicago, New York had combined storm and sanitary sewers. Everything works fine when it's not raining. The sewage goes to the sewage treatment plant, gets treated, then gets discharged to a receiving water body. But when it rains, it's a combined system. It overwhelms, it exceeds the carrying capacity of the system and gets discharged at different points. That's a combined sewer overflow. Between the 60s and 80s, there was a 4,000 metric ton per day decrease in chloride loadings to the river. We've seen an 80% decline in mercury in fish since the mercury crisis of 1970. An 88% decline in DDT and a 90% decline in PCBs in herring gull eggs on Fighting Island in the middle of the Detroit River. And we've remediated a bunch of contaminated sediments, but aren't done. We have much more to do. These improvements are heartening, but that's not the best part of the story. The best part of the story is bald eagles are back. For 20 years, none could reproduce in our watershed because of those pesticides. They are back. Now we have 25 active nests in the watershed. Same thing for peregrine falcons. They were decimated in our region by pesticides. They were reintroduced into Detroit, into the skyscrapers in downtown Detroit. They lived in the cliffs up in the UP, skyscrapers in hacking boxes. The triangles are the number fledged, and now we are fledging 20 or more young per year in metropolitan Detroit. Same story for osprey. They were decimated. By 1999, there was only one active nest in all of southern Michigan. Osprey were reintroduced, part of rewilding in the late 90s. Now we have 50 or more active nests in southeast Michigan. Sturgeon. We did everything humanly possible to degrade the sturgeon population. First of all, they're lithophilic spawners, rock-loving spawners. So they spawned in the rapids of the Detroit River. Well, we built the shipping channels in the river, starting in the late 1800s and early 1900s. That was their spawning habitat. We pulled all that out there so there could be 23 feet of depth for the freighters. Then we've lost 97% of our coastal wetland habitat. That was their nursery habitat. Then in adding insult to injury, we used to harvest sturgeon, dry them out on the docks of the Detroit River, and use them as a fuel source for steamers on the river. So we really did everything to them. From the 70s to 2000, we had fishery biologists looking for spawning in the river. They could find that. Then in 2001, they found them spawning off a coal cinder pile off of Zug Island. Who would ever have thought that was possible? Since then, we've built 11 sturgeon spawning reefs in the river. Their population is now estimated at over 4,000 in the river. And this is a great photo taken by some colleagues who are right here out of the Gibraltar Fish and Wildlife Service Office for Fisheries. And they captured a couple of years ago this 6-foot 10-inch sturgeon in the river, 240 pounds. It's a female biologist. She laid down next to it just to give you a perspective of how big it was. One of the largest ever caught in the United States. This photo went viral across the United States as well. There was also a substantial decline in lake whitefish. Most people know that from eating them in restaurants And like whitefish are also lithophilic spawners. And in 2006, they found them again spawning in the river. And that was the first time since 1916. And walleye back in the 70s were considered in a crisis state by the Lake Erie Committee of the Great Lakes Fishery Commission. Well, they're back in a big way. Now we, of course, Lake Erie and Detroit River are considered the walleye capital of the world. This is a 14.2-pound walleye caught right out here in one of the Downriver Walleye Federation tournaments. And of course, that brings in $1 million to our economy every spring, right now, of people coming in for tournaments and to fish this amazing walleye country. And then back in the fur trade area, hundreds of years ago, they extirpated, they hunted to local extinction beaver. During the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, they could not have lived in the river because there was so much oil in the river. Oil would have coated their fur. They couldn't thermoregulate. They couldn't keep warm. They would have died. Well, as the river cleaned up, 2008, a pair of beaver came swimming over to the upper end of the river to the Connor Creek power plant and built a lodge, had a couple of pups, and now they're in numerous locations in the watershed. The other one that was extirpated during the fur trade era was the river otter. And then back in 2022, a student at the University of Windsor was walking along the shore of the Detroit River, saw a head pop out, dove in the water. The tail wasn't a beaver, too big to be a muskrat. He says, "Oh my gosh, it's a river otter." He had the wherewithal to take some videos of it, and it was the first time in 100 years they had seen one in the Detroit River. This is a good example. In eastern Lake Erie, the state of Ohio had some very relatively clean streams there, and river otter had been extirpated there. And they said, we should bring in some river otter and see if they would do well in these eastern Lake Erie streams. So they brought them in, and they did well, and they were adventurous, and they moved out. They went over to Cleveland and the Cuyahoga Valley National Park and did well there. Then went over to Cedar Point and National Wildlife Refuge and Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge. Then they swam across the lake to, using the archipelago, Whitten Bay, Healy Island, all the way to Point Pelee, and they were discovered there. And we thought at that point, it's a matter of time before they came up. So that's how they got here, but it's an example of reintroducing a species. We benefited from that. If you add all that up, the return of bald eagles, peregrine falcons, osprey, lake sturgeon, lake whitefish, walleye, beaver, otter, it's one of the most remarkable ecological recovery stories in North America. So rewilding of Metro Detroit has occurred through reintroduction of peregrine falcons and osprey, and return of central species like bald eagles, lake sturgeon, lake whitefish, walleye, beaver, and river otter. But the river otter were really reintroduced into eastern Lake Erie, and then they came over. Rewilding has helped showcase the value and benefits of environmental protection and restoration, ecosystem services or ecosystem benefits, habitat rehabilitation and enhancement, and conservation. The benefits, there are many benefits from this. Healthier ecosystem, enhanced biodiversity, helps lead to development of a conservation or a stewardship ethic in our communities. Studies show that spending time in nature improves mental and physical health. Canadian doctors are now prescribing free passes to Canadian national parks to improve people's mental and physical health. So what can we all do? We can establish a native lawn. We can build a pollinator garden or a rain garden. We can advocate for greening, expanding green spaces in our community. We can help create green infrastructure. We can support greenways that also have natural habitats along them, which then will allow greenways to also serve as wildlife corridors. We can remove invasive species, and we can work to establish natural habitats in parks, schools, churches, and businesses. Good examples of that right here in Trenton. When Carol Fink and I have been working with St. Philip Lutheran Church and the Perennial Waters Project, and we built a pollinator garden with the Fish and Wildlife Service and a rain garden. And as Aaron mentioned, well, a really cool next project for the community is a pollinator meadow at Trenton Veterans Memorial Library. So this is kind of West Road down here. This is kind of the football field right here. This is Westfield. This is kind of where the library is. This is the Franken Poet Drain here. And this little red area down here is where the pollinator meadow will be. You know, we have plans of building it. The mayor just signed a letter of commitment with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They're going to help do that. We want to have an interpretive sign maybe on West Road so people know what that is. We also going to maybe have a bench and do some other things there as well. But a great example of what can be done. So Rewilding is teaching us about the power of nature to heal itself, and in the process, heal us too. There's also a process that gives hope to the future. And with that, happy Earth Day. Any questions? Any thoughts? Yes.
Considering how polluted the Detroit River
Yeah.
was at one time and how much it's been cleaned up, how safe, in your opinion, is it to eat walleye, and how often?
Yeah, good question. So the good news is the worst contamination levels were back in the 70s, you know. That's when there was the mercury crisis, both Lake St. Clair, and it was Sarnia, Ontario, and Wyandotte Chemical back in the days in the 50s and 60s. So we have seen an 80% decline in mercury concentrations in walleye. It's good news. Are they all safe to eat? No, we still have health advisories on them. So they say the bigger the fish in terms of a walleye, the more fat it has, the higher the burden of contaminants, okay? So there's still health advisories saying, you know, women of childbearing age and children should eat none, and others should eat half a pound per week based on that. But there are fish in the river like yellow perch that are very lean, don't have a lot of fat, and are safe to eat. So there's a variety of them, but we have more work to do. We still have 5 million cubic yards of contaminated sediments that are contributing to these health advisories on fish. It's going to take a lot of money. And right now it's an incredibly challenging time with what's going on, and we don't want to lose any of that money. So we have more work to do. Good question. Yes.
You did a fantastic job with the Detroit River International Wildlife Refuge, and we're all indebted to you for that. But could you tell us a little bit about what you're doing nowadays?
Yeah, Aaron and I were just talking about that. Working with wind now, the next on some projects here through perennial waters, but my latest project is, one of the things we need to do is reconnect people to these amazing water resources, to this amazing biodiversity. For generations, we had limited public access to the river. So I've been working with the Community Foundation for Southeast Michigan on the Great Lakes Way, an interconnected set of greenways and water trails from Port Huron down to Toledo, and then working with our Canadian partners to be able to cross the new Gordie Howe International Bridge on a bicycle and enjoy both sides of the river. And I'm also working with Jessica Leinhardt on expanding that idea to all 8 states. So the whole US portion of the Great Lakes. It would be a Great Lakes waterfront trail that would be a mirror image of the Canadian one that's been around for 30 years, 30 plus years. And it would link at certain points like the Gordie Howe International Bridge, the Peace Bridge in Niagara Falls, Ontario, the bridge between Cornwall, Ontario and Messina, New York, and up in Minnesota. So what an opportunity to have a trail of almost international significance because of the Great Lakes, because they are 20% of the standing fresh water on the Earth's surface, to reconnect people to water, to reap all those benefits, but also to get people to care more, to be inspired by these water resources, and then develop a stewardship ethic. So that's what we're working on. Very fun.
Another question.
Sure, go ahead.
And show my ignorance there. You talked about the pollinator gardens, is that what you call it?
Yeah, pollinators.
What is that?
Well, I'll let Wynn answer that, but pollinators are bees and butterflies and even some birds and stuff like, and pollinators move pollen so that we can, that a lot of the food we eat are dependent on that, and we've lost a lot of pollinator habitat over many, many decades. So this is where the strategy is to work with libraries, with churches, with schools, with people to build them, to get them involved, give them something that they contribute to it. So think of the monarch butterfly, right? And how, what?
We used to have so many of them when I was young,
Yeah, so many.
and then they just like disappeared.
They disappeared. And the milkweed, right? And you need that. And so you go to a pollinator garden, there's gonna be a bunch of milkweed in there, And so it's something that we can all do to participate in this and help restore monarchs and bees and all the benefits of pollinating as well.
Where can you purchase milkweed?
You can get it. There's what's that native, there's several native gene pool nurseries in this area. There's one out in Ann Arbor. Well, we can get you a name for that. I can't do it off the
That was
top.
just a Pinter greenhouse in Belleville and they didn't have it.
They didn't have any. Well, I know there are some because we bought from some of them. Yeah.
Well, I had a source over in Ypsilanti, but fortunately she closed and she doesn't seem to receive my emails anymore. The question about the pollinator garden is interesting too, because, part of what gets our spirits up about this whole thing is the, charismatic megafauna. We're talking earlier about elk populations and wolf populations in Yellowstone, but we're talking about butterflies and bees and, and we're looking at a field next to the library that's gonna kind of probably to some of us look kind of, I don't know, maybe kind of sloppy. We're often used to having our lawn mowed and it's gonna be all these wildflowers and tall grasses. And it's just gonna look like somebody's brought them up for a while, probably a few years before it starts to really look. We get used to it and the flowers really come into But, we're not talking about necessarily, beaver. Or the kinds of, we're not talking about what might, except for we're gonna, might see eagles flying over or something, but, this is where, what you're doing here is really reminding us to think in a very different way about, what we're used to from years past where, we wanna see this beautiful sort of manicured garden out here.
Right.
It's not gonna look like that. And we'll get used to it and it'll be all the more beautiful, but. If what we wanna talk about are elk populations, it's a very different conversation.
But that's part of the educational process we have to go through, and then we're gonna be doing that with the library, right? We're involved the high school and the community, we've had to go before the city council, and so. But the long-term benefits, and then, the pollinator meadow is gonna have different flowering plants by season, different colors by season, so it's intentionally designed to be beautiful, but for the first couple of years, it's gonna struggle. And
Pollinator, fields, do they also attract like hummingbirds or? Okay.
Sure, yeah, sure.
yeah,
Cause I've only heard like the butterflies and the bees, but
Also
I've been
attract
noticing
bats,
more.
bats for,
Yeah, I've been noticing more hummingbirds just in the last couple of years.
yeah, really exciting. And then this US Fish and Wildlife Service program that first helped perennial waters at St. Philip and now is helping the library. They've stepped back and said, we need to provide assistance to churches, schools, libraries, businesses to do this on land we don't own for the benefit of all wildlife and everything else. So it's a great example. And we've also done, we've been involved in a green infrastructure project at Grace in Action in Southwest Detroit. The churches in Detroit have these stormwater fees, $450 a month, beyond your electrical bill, your gas bill, your water and sewage bill. They have a separate stormwater bill based on impervious surface, rooftop, parking lot. Churches have lots of parking lot. So we're taking some of that out and restoring green infrastructure so they can absorb stormwater, lower their stormwater fees, and teach stewardship at the same time. So we're working on some of that. Yes.
So has the mass demolition of all of those vacant homes, has that helped with
Yes.
that? I mean, has anybody done a study that has shown the difference? Because they really did a lot in the last like 5
So
years.
think of Detroit in 1950, it had what? 1.8 million people living in Detroit, not Detroit metropolitan area, Detroit. And so now there are a little over 600,000 in there. So a lot of homes and businesses and industries have gone out. And one of the really cool things is how pheasants have expanded in Detroit. And they're now you see them everywhere because they have habitat. So they are taking over, and they're working on grassland habitat for birds with the old Detroit Audubon, which is called Detroit Bird City. And so there's a lot going on to reclaim some of that land for nature and outdoor recreation.
Community gardens also.
Community gardens, absolutely. And Green of Detroit is working on that with all the trees and everything. And so, yeah, but the message is we all have to do our part and all have to get involved,
Do we have any problems, like when I lived in LA, they had the issue where the freeways cut the wildlife from each other, so now, what is it Wallace, I think is her name, she paid to have those crosswalks so that the You know,
Yeah.
the
Wildlife
animals,
crossing.
the wildlife could at least mate again and, you
Oh,
know, be
yeah.
reconnected. Do we have any of that issue in this area?
Oh, yeah, we have definitely, wildlife need corridors to get places, right? And we have lots of examples of where they can't get there, so that's why this whole idea of greenways can also, they are green because of habitat, you know what I mean? It's not just a bike path, but it can be a trail with habitat on each side, and that can become a wildlife corridor,
Yeah, the ones in LA look like bridges, but they're all
Yeah.
parks, basically.
So,
They're all green.
The latest example of that wildlife crossing is over in Windsor right now. And they're working on this Ojibwe National Park.
I read about that, yeah.
And so they have a big street that is a big barrier to wildlife, and they've documented mortality of snakes and turtles and wildlife crossing this road. So they are going to be building an elevated crossing just for wildlife. If you go out on Highway 1 in Western Canada, you see those wildlife crossings for elk and stuff like that. They're pretty
But
amazing.
in LA is pretty cool,
Yeah, they're very cool to see what they are,
because there's so much concrete in
Yeah,
LA
it's so
that it's
concrete.
just really cool to see that.
Yeah. But how neat is this for Detroit to be, we're known as the automobile capital of the United States. We're known as the Rust Belt, where there's lots of tags to Detroit, but to be an international leader in rewilding and then reconnecting people to these waterways, the Detroit Riverwalk, Downriver Link Greenways, the Great Lakes Way, the Great Lakes Waterfront Trail. That's where we want to go to.
What do you think about the green roofs? On the buildings and stuff?
They're a great idea, because that absorbs stormwater, right?
Right.
Doesn't run off and create a problem somewhere else, but it also creates habitat for birds and bees and everything else. And
Why is that not as prevalent? It just seems to me to be a simple idea. What's holding it back from?
well,
Pardon?
as a society, we got used to we want asphalt shingles, right? I'd say to you, you look at, if you get the right people to the table in the design phase at the Rouge plant,
Which plant has one, yeah.
has a 12-acre living roof of sedum, other species.
They've been around a long time, so I'm
Yeah, and
surprised that in Detroit they haven't.
And you look in Detroit, there are certain buildings that have it, certain parking structures now. I wouldn't say it's common, but they are out there and it's coming. I think we will see more of it in the future,
I think Chicago's embracing it a little bit more than Detroit.
and Toronto.
Yeah,
Chicago and
Toronto.
Toronto are both embracing that whole idea. Yeah. Jess?
It's the greatest threat to the progress we've made.
People.
Right now?
Right now. Starts with
She knows what she's at. What's going on in this downsizing, defunding, deregulating of federal government is the biggest threat to this ecological recovery of the Detroit River. They want a 65% reduction in EPA staff and programs. They want, just go down the list of.
They want to sell off our national parks.
I had that one slide in there that public outcry over pollution led to the National Environmental Policy Act of 1970, the Canada Water Act of 1970, the U.S. Clean Water Act of 1972, the Canada-U.S. Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement of 1972, and the Endangered Species Act of 1973. All those are under threat. We looked at the systematic weakening of all those laws. What's that affect? What's it? In jeopardy is all of that. So, you know, we need to speak out about that and, yeah, I'm very worried about it. And, you know, they've come out and say, well, these are wasteful programs. They're not wasteful programs. You know, this is misinformation and misinformation. You know, there's so much good that's going on. And maybe we need to do a better job of telling our story, right? Like this. But we need to have an environmental spring right now to counteract this, to save some of these programs, to protect some of these laws, so we can have, all of the people in this room can have a healthier environment now, and the next generation that follows can have a better place. If we don't do that, that's what's at stake. Thank you for asking the question.
There is someone on Zoom who has a question, and I'm not very good with Zoom, so we're gonna figure out how to.
Hi, yeah,
Maybe a little feedback, I hope not.
Oh, she's gonna do it. Work it, okay?
so I had a comment on milkweed sourcing. Can you guys hear me?
A little bit. I can hear you, but I don't think anyone else can. Go
Oh,
ahead.
so on milkweed sourcing, I really like going to empty lots in my area that are for sale. And I will actually dig up young native plants like milkweed, but you do want to get it young because it's got that taproot that develops. And but you can find milkweed, ironweed, goldenrod, asters in empty lots. So that is cheaper, and when they're sold, they'll probably end up being cut down and herbicided anyway. So I think that's it can be useful for someone trying to get started. And then my question,
Let me share that with the audience, then you, so I don't lose that thought, you know. You
Oh,
said
yeah.
some of the vacant lots, like in Detroit and Wayne County, can be sources of milkweed and other plants. And we can harvest those species and use them for places in our gardens and everything else before they're herbicide or mowed over or whatever. And then what's your question?
My question, so it seems really exciting about the beavers coming back to the Detroit River and building their populations and reproducing. But I've heard several instances in the last few years of the DNR treating them as nuisances. And I mean, I am in favor of letting them build more wetlands in the area. What do you think about them? Do you think they've rebounded back enough to be nuisances?
Yes. The question is, you know, beaver in some places can be a nuisance, right? They're the ultimate engineer. They can build dams and flood areas and create problems. And there's some worry about that. And she's saying, you know, the DNR is taken out some beaver in certain places within the state. That is not a problem in the Rouge and Detroit River now. I know on Groseal you can see places where they have cut down trees, and you could see that, but there are no major problems at this point. But I think a lot of people in the conservation and environmental field are so pleased to have them back, you know, and they are not in large numbers, you know, that it is such an important thing for our home to have them here. So it's not an important thing to do in our area right now.
Thank you.
All right.
Hey, I have one, John.
Okay, Win, go ahead.
So, recently, as you know, I'm down a bit further downriver in Rockwood, and
Yep.
our neighbor over in, it's very new to me, our neighbors over in Flat Rock have a dam just upstream from Huron Park, just west of Telegraph at Huron River Drive.
Yep.
And there's recently, what I've just come to learn about, I don't know how long this has been going on, but there's a pretty nuanced debate and argument going on about the dam that some people are proposing to take that dam out, which would essentially drain a whole lot of open water just upstream. And on one hand, that seems pretty devastating to a lot of homeowners on that water right there. And I think there's some perhaps somewhat solid, although I'm not sure, I don't know how well you know this debate, somewhat solid ecological reasoning for taking that dam out. And you know, I think it's one of those things that comes up as just it's either a bad idea or a good idea, but I don't know if you've heard anything about this and what your position
Yeah,
is
there's
about that.
You know, dams were put in for hydroelectric purposes years and years ago, you know, like when Henry Ford started doing his cottage industries, he built hydroelectric dams, and those are barriers for fish migration, right? So once you do that, so now in more recent years, they've looked at if they're not being used for hydroelectric purposes, they're a deterrent to ecological benefits, right? And so fish migration. So on the Rouge River, several dams have been taken out, you know? And the one thing I would caution there is like think of behind the dam, you know, the water flows down from the Huron River. So behind the dam, a bunch of sediments build up over decades and decades and decades. And were some contaminants in there, you know? So if you take that dam out, what are the unintended consequences? Are you gonna spread those contaminants out? So right now it's at the preliminary thinking stage. They're gonna have to do modeling to see the water flows and how that's gonna affect upstream and downstream. They're gonna have to look at the contaminated sediment issue. Throughout the Great Lakes, that's happening in many areas. In Cleveland, they have a big dam project right now that they're removing, and it's going to be a $50 million contaminated sediment remediation project first before you can remove the dam. Then you can do this, but then they're going to be able to create some whitewater kayaking in there as well. So it can be done, but it has to be done well and based on good science as well. Well, thank you all for coming out, and happy Earth Day.